But I think the John Birch Society is also known for almost never trumpeting and tooting its own horn. We were always trying to be, efficacious in doing the work that we do without being braggadocious about it. Because our point wasn't to get the accolades of man as a society, but to save our freedom as a country. So it had nothing to do with just building up our egos. It had to do with doing the job, getting the task done. And who cares who gets the credit? The sad thing about that is, without taking credit where credit's due, we don't necessarily draw people to the leadership of the John Birch Society and to join the organization with us. And so we need to sometimes toot our horn a little bit. So I'm going to do that a little bit. I'll give you an example of that. I remember 1998, the front cover of our magazine, this is the magazine, The New American. Front cover of our magazine, The New American, was the picture of Osama bin Laden. And it said, "Is this the face of terrorism?" This was 1998. It was quite a while before September 11, 2001, shocked America awake and showed us how vulnerable we were to terrorism. We were already giving a warning about it, but who was listening? How many were listening to what we had to say about it? And I remember holding that up in a meeting in 2003 and saying, how many of you know when this was published? Because the reason I held it up is a lady said something derogatory about the John Birch Society, so I just stood right up and held up the magazine and said, we published this in 1998. Who else was warning you about Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in 1998? Tell me a name. Was Time Magazine, New York Times, Wall Street Journal? Who else? It was us. So we're known for giving warnings and being ahead of the curve, and sometimes being ahead of the curve makes you look crazy. People think, God, this I haven't heard this anywhere else. These Birchers, they're kooks, they're nuts. What do they think about this kind of stuff? And so that sometimes happens. Well, some of the things we've given warnings of require a deeper look to find out if what we're telling is the truth or not, too. And so people would judge us because maybe we're a decade ahead of the curve. We're 2 decades ahead of the curve. And I'll give you an example of that, too, in this respect. In 2008, a young man phoned me and asked me, he said, I'm with the End the Fed group up here in Salt Lake. I know you're on our website as a member. We'd like you to be our keynote speaker at our End the Fed speech on November the 22nd in front of the Federal Reserve building on State Street in Salt Lake City. And I said, well, do you have a permit from the police department? And he says, yeah. And I said, do you have a podium and a microphone and speakers because there's traffic? He says, yes. And I said, okay, I'll come and speak. And so I went up there and I started out this way. I held up a big thick book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve System. And I said, there's about 150 people there. And I said, how many of you have seen this book? And everybody raised their hands. I said, that's great. How many of you have read this book? And it's about a 650-page book. And about 2/3 of the hands went down. And I said, wow, I'm impressed that many of you have read this big book. Because not everybody likes to read anymore. I said, now how many of you know who published this book in 1994? And all the hands went down. And I said, well, ladies and gentlemen, the John Birch Society published this book. G. Edward Griffin, the author of this book, was an employee of our magazine, The New American, at that time as an editor. And so I want to welcome you to our fight to end the Fed. Now, I tell you that because we were way ahead of the curve warning people, the John Birch Society, back in the 1960s and 70s, about the Federal Reserve System as a private banking cartel set up by Congress in 1913 that was destroying our monetary system, that had taken us off the gold standard, off the silver standard, that was debauching our currency and creating inflationary monetary policies that would build the availability of credit and money to a point that the value of the money decreased. So just like a counterfeiter increasing the supply of money, the value of that money went down. And that's where you get the rising prices there to make up for the oversupply of money. And so the John Birch Society had been warning about that and inflation for decades before this End the Fed group was formed up there in Salt Lake. And they recognized that. I started to tell them about some of the other things we'd written about that, like the book Financial Terrorism in 1995 by the president of the John Birch Society, John F. McManus. Well, we're also known for our constant message for the last 5 decades to get us out of the United Nations. I think everybody in America has heard our slogan, get us out of the United Nations, get the United Nations out of the United States. We've been warning that since 1958. Well, this is a new reprint, one of our magazines recently, and in it, we detail where all the headquarters of all the bureaucracies and departments and functioning organizations of the United Nations are headquartered around the globe to help demonstrate that this is indeed a global government in the making. And I'm not going to read all this to you because then we'd really take all night, wouldn't we? But I just wanted to read to you what's headquartered from the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. ILO, the International Labor Organization of the United Nations. ITU, the International Telecommunication Union of the United Nations. UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. WHO, the World Health Organization of the United Nations. WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization of the United Nations. WMO, the World Meteorological Organization of the UN. UNCOR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. UNIDOR, United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, Disarm You. UNAIDS, Joint United Nations Program on HIV and AIDS. UNICIDOR, United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. UNIS, United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. UNITAR, United Nations Institute for Training and Research. And then next door in Bern, Switzerland, is the UPU, Universal Postal Union of the United Nations. We've been warning about the United Nations being on the brink of becoming world government because it's being strengthened to be so for 55 years, all right? So a lot of Americans today know that there's bad things about the UN, and they know it because, you know, we publish articles about it. Here's one of our recent articles about the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty Conference held in March in New York City. We sent our reporter, Joe Wolverton II, he's a constitutional lawyer, lives down in Provo, Utah. We sent him to New York City to attend this conference and to report on it. And when he got back, I had him speak to 200 people in Lehigh, Utah, to tell them about it. And we invited reporters from all over Utah, and guess how many showed up to get the information, you know? 0. None of them showed up, which is often the case when it's news they don't want to know, or they're in denial of it. But this trade treaty, President Barack Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry required our ambassadors to the UN to sign on to this treaty. And then it was brought back to the Senate, and the Senate did not ratify it, thank God, this time. Doesn't mean it won't be ratified in the future, because now we're signed on to it. But if this treaty is ratified, it requires every nation that ratifies it to build a registry of all firearms, shotguns, rifles, pistols, you name it, all firearms within their nation that are owned by their civilian population. and all accoutrements that go with firearms, clips, slings, scopes, all ammunition, everything. And then to confiscate all of it. Confiscate it all. Because we cannot trust civilians to have armaments. Because civilians might cause insurrections. But we can trust governments to have all the armaments of the world in a monopoly of force in their hands, according to the United Nations. Despite the fact that 300 million people in the last century were killed by governments with weapons. 300 million. Now, I like to look at, what's his name? Serial killers. Serial killers like
Ted Bundy.
Ted Bundy, that's the one I was looking for.
Yeah.
Ted Bundy, there he was. I saw him the night before he was executed.
Oh.
And they asked Ted,
For
how
such
many women did you
studies.
kill? And he said, well, it's a triple digit number. Okay, now up till then, the books written about him, it showed 33 women he killed across the states. And of course, it was easy to kill them because they'd all been disarmed by their governments that told them they couldn't carry concealed weapons unless they had a concealed carry permit. And in Utah at that time, you couldn't get a concealed carry permit usually unless you were a policeman. You had to prove to a set of bureaucrats that your life was being threatened, or you couldn't get a concealed carry permit. I know because I got the law changed, so I know. I testified to the governor's weapons task force, and I'll get the law changed. But that was 1994. But the point is that he said a triple digit, so that means somewhere between 100 and 999 women. We'll never know, will we? How many women he actually killed. But he's a hiker. Adolf Hitler killed 6 million to 25 million people. Not in war, in concentration camps and death camps, and murder in the back of his black vehicles that would drive along with people in them and pumping the exhaust into the vehicles. Joseph Stalin is credited with 35 million killed. Mao Zedong is credited with 70 million, 60 to 70 million Chinese that he murdered. So Ted Bundy's nothing compared to these megalomaniac monsters who take over government power and utilize government armaments against the people. Now, if you've ever read that book, Mao, The Unknown Story, it's 880 pages of horror, written by Jun Chang, a Chinese woman who lived there in China and who got a PhD in England. You know the story of how he delighted in terrorizing the populace of China and murdering them in many different ways. It was just delightful to Mao Zedong. But people don't want to know about that, and yet that is part of the communist dynamic. And the United Nations wants to arm Mao and Stalin and their friends. Those are the kind of people that, if they disarm us, we the people, the civilian population, they'll be arming those megalomaniacs, including those that are within their ranks. Because remember, the United Nations has 190 nation members, almost every nation on earth. There's one left that hasn't joined, the Vatican.
Which one?
Little nation state, one teeny tiny nation state hasn't joined. And funny thing, they each get a vote. So little teeny tiny Lithuania, what's that little tiny one in Europe? It's so little. Luxembourg. They get a vote equal to the United States in the general assembly. Now it is true that there's 15 members of the UN Security Council, 5 permanent members. Thank you. No, don't, because it's my old timers kicking in. So I appreciate it. And we're on that, and we have a veto. But the other thing we're known for goes along with this. The John Birch Society has been known for a long time